back to the Swamp247 Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Goldkamp, here with my co-host, Jacob Rudner. Jacob, we had the 2022 NFL Draft starting Thursday, finishing on Saturday. Pretty light year for Florida by Florida standards. I think 3 draft picks in total, and that was the fewest for Florida in a decade. The last time the Florida Gators had that few draft picks was when they had 2 back in 2012 when only Chris Rainey and Jay Howard were drafted. So I think first and foremost, Jacob, this kind of sets the tone for what Billy Napier is walking into. Obviously, there's a lot to be done here, I think, is the first real takeaway.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I think that just with Florida's history and the amount of players it's had drafted in the past, I mean, you even look at first round numbers, for example, Florida's had 13 guys drafted in the first round in the last 10 selections, and that includes Kaiir Elam, who was taken by the Buffalo Bills at the 23rd overall pick this year. So there's obviously a lot of prestige when it comes to transitioning players from college to the pros at this university, and I don't think anybody is trying to deny that. And so it's honestly, if you're Billy Napier, it's a great starting point. It's not too high. The bar, if anything, is quite low. I mean, 3 guys drafted, like you said, is a historically bad number relative to past drafts as it pertains to Florida players. And granted, Florida has had at least 1 player selected in every draft, I believe, since the modern draft started, which is one of 3 schools. Yeah, one of 3 schools to be able to do that. And now the number that they have to beat is 3. And so, and I should add, by the way, that the guys on the roster right now aren't even Napier's guys. So, it's on him and his coaching staff to be able to elevate the players that they currently have. But it certainly is a very reasonable starting point, I think. If you're Billy Napier looking at that number, you go, I think I can beat that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of this in the second half of the show. I do think there's a lot of guys when you start to go down the roster and look at guys that could potentially be drafted next year, whether it's seniors or underclassmen. You got a pretty big list where you think, okay, that guy's got some potential if this staff can develop him. And again, we'll get to that in the second half of the show. But the bottom line is, look, if Florida wants to be where Florida should be and really be competing for championships, you got to be producing more than 3 NFL draft picks. That's the bottom line. Let's talk about some of the individuals here. I don't know if you have any specific thoughts on where the guys went, but Kaiir Elam in the first round at number 23 to the Buffalo Bills. Jacob, we've seen some of the one of my favorite parts of the draft is always when you see the footage, that gets put out from draft night. And obviously, he was very emotional with his family that night. But I thought one of the funnier or cooler things was the phone call that he had with the Bills personnel, where he's like, put the playbook on the plane, like put the playbook on the plane. And I've covered Kaiir for the last 3 years here at Florida. I remember the first interaction I really had with him was in the locker room 3 years ago. It was after a bowl game. So I think it was after one of the, now I'm forgetting whether it was the Chick-fil-A or the Sugar Bowl. But we walked into the locker room and Florida had just won the game. And Kaiir was basically just like, I felt like I had a pretty bad year. And this is a guy that played as a freshman and was already looking, to try to get better. I don't know what you made of, just what you saw out of Kaiir, but talking to him at Pro Day, I'm sure you come away with the impression that he's a pretty mature guy.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the way that he carries himself is impressive. I loved, like you said, the part where he asked about the playbook. And I don't know if you saw the clip of him at the Combine when he had an interview with the Bills. He handed over his Florida playbook with his notes and basically said, I took notes on every explosive play that I gave up, why I gave it up, notes that I got from opposing wide receivers and things that I thought I did wrong because I learned from all these kinds of things and I love to study and all that. I thought it was a great pick by the Bills to actually trade it up to be able to make it happen. And so, it's a great landing spot. It's a good defense. And by the way, in a team that is really in the thick of the Super Bowl race at this point, just with a great offense, Josh Allen at quarterback and Stephon Diggs just re-signed. You have Von Miller on the defensive front. So yeah, it's a good spot for him. And, based on everything that I was able to see on the pre-draft stuff and the way that he conducted himself throughout this process, I was really impressed with him overall.
Any thoughts on Zachary Carter going 3rd round to the Cincinnati Bengals, and then Dameon Pierce went 4th round to the Houston Texans? I had been talking to one colleague who had talked to, I guess, an NFL scout who wasn't very high on Dameon Pierce and sort of had him as a 7th rounder. And I was like, what? I was like, this is a guy that doesn't have much wear and tear on him. Yeah. I mean, can really do it all. Curious what you thought about those 2 selections.
I liked both of them. I mean, I think that for Carter, it's another one of those situations where I think it's a good fit. I think that's kind of a defense that's going to be able to play to his strengths. He's a versatile defensive lineman who's going to be able to play a couple roles and kind of find playing time based on his versatility. And the Bengals are going to find a way to maximize that. I mean, that's always a good place to be. If you're a guy like Zachary Carter, who when we were at Pro Day, we talked to him and he basically said, I'm not telling teams that I'm more comfortable as an interior and exterior defensive lineman. It's wherever they need me. And I'll, put myself in a position from a physical standpoint and a mental standpoint to be able to succeed either way. And so that's good anywhere. And I think that makes you a guy who's, somebody who has a chance at least to succeed in any defense that you end up in. And then with Pierce, he's going to have an opportunity to compete for RB1 positioning directly into his rookie year. I mean, that's a situation that's pretty favorable for a running back. And it sounds like the Texans would agree with you that a 7th round evaluation is a little low.
Yeah. I don't know. To me, for one, I've not seen a pass blocking running back as good as Dameon Pierce in the decade long that I've been doing this full time at Florida. I mean, he is really, really good. When he came into Florida, was not a good pass catcher at all. I remember watching him in practices back when that was a thing before COVID, when we'd go out there to spring practice and stuff like that. And man, the guy had hands of stone. I'm not lying to you. LaMichael Pirine was a really, really good pass catching back. But honestly, even Malik Davis wasn't that great of a pass catcher early on. And that was something that, Dameon Pierce and Malik Davis really, really developed as they sort of grew into things. And I think he's going to be a great fit there. Going back to, I guess, Florida, sort of being down on talent a little bit, I will say, I think part of that this year was in part because two of the guys that were maybe borderline draftable guys in Jeremiah Moon and Malik Davis both had injury histories. I think if you take away the injury history from either of those guys, they probably get drafted. But Jeremiah Moon's a guy that, has had repeated foot issues throughout his Florida career. Malik Davis has had multiple knee injuries, as well as, I believe, a broken foot at one point. So, those are things that, you look on paper talent-wise, those are guys that probably can carve out a role in the NFL if they can stay healthy. I think teams generally just try to avoid, guys that have 2, 3, major injuries that have kept them off the field.
Right. No, there's no doubt.
Jacob, one thing I sort of picked up on, and I don't know, you can tell me maybe if this is just my perception, but it seems like from a marketing standpoint, and maybe this is a product of Florida having sort of a down year in the draft itself, but it seems like more of the pitch from the UF side of things coming out of the draft has been sort of, look at what our assistants have done in terms of developing guys other places.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's a bad strategy at all. I think that there are two main factors. The first is it's not a good look, even if Florida had an explosive draft and they had, let's say 7, 8 players selected or more, for this staff to lay any claim on those players, I think is a bad look. They didn't do anything to develop those guys. They didn't recruit them to Florida. They were not at any point their responsibility. And so from a university pride standpoint, I would understand obviously touting your draft picks because they came through the school. But to a degree, I think that there is a level of smartness that occurs when the staff goes, okay, let's be proud of the guys who have graduated the program, who are now in the NFL. They are forever Florida alumni, and we're going to celebrate that as its own thing. But we also need to be able to play up the fact that we have assistants or even a head coach on staff who also, in their own right, were very successful getting guys to the next level. Because at the end of the day, past success is great, and having program alumni is great, especially nowadays when we're in this market of, being able to maintain a relationship with the guys who have come through your program and using them as financial resources. It's a huge deal. At the same time, though, for the coaching staff to say anything along the lines of, these are our guys, well, they're not. You didn't do anything with them. Now, they did do an amazing job, however, of laying claim to the guys that they deserve to lay claim to. Kerry Colbert was at the draft with Drake London. That's a huge deal. You're able to basically say, that's my guy. I trained him when he was at USC. I was his coach. Here he is now. Look at what he's done. Corey Raymond was there with Derek Stingley. He was able to say, here's a guy who I've trained. Look at how well he's done.
And put in a Gator chomp in a video in the process.
Including, right, great marketing. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think honestly it capitalizes on an opportunity to play to the individual strengths that the Gators might have on staff. And that at the end of the day is a good move because it doesn't cross the line, in my opinion, of trying to take credit for something that isn't yours to take credit for, while also being able to play up the strengths of what you might actually have in the building.
Yeah, and I think if you're, looking at it from a sales pitch standpoint, you kind of luck into Florida only having 3 draft picks and then saying, hey, well, guess what? We produced 2 at Louisiana. And that's a place that, you look on paper recruiting-wise, we had a lot less to work with. So, we did develop these guys like Max Mitchell and the safety over there, Percy Butler?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and those 2 fourth-round guys, that's pretty decent for Louisiana. You look at, Rob Sale's history. He's had 3 draft picks now. Of guys that have come out of Louisiana on the offensive line. And I guess, with Max Mitchell, you can give Darnell Stapleton credit for his final year of development. So you've got, between the 2 Florida O-line coaches, 3 draft picks out of Louisiana now. Osiris Torrance, probably going to be a 4th. So you really can sell sort of, no, Florida's not quite where it needs to be, but, we can develop guys. And we've shown that. And I think that's kind of the angle that Florida has taken. And I think from here, you can sort of sell, hey, our task is to get this back up to where Florida's having 7, 8 draft picks, in a given year. And I think the potential has always been there to do that. It'll be curious to see how well this staff does sort of selling that, not only on the recruiting trail, but also with the current players. Because I think that the current player buy-in is going to be as important as anything.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, it's just as important to have the guys who you have in-house behind you, just the same way that you want to ramp things up on the recruiting end and bring in talent. And I would also say, and this is, kind of a convenient segue into the other thing we're going to talk about right now. And it's also important in the transfer portal. You're able to market, you might not feel, player X might not feel like you had the opportunity to maximize your talents or putting yourself on track to have a professional career and get drafted. Well, look at what we did. We have a first-round wide receiver. We have a first-round defensive back. We have guys who were able to recruit and make these players who were at Louisiana draft picks in the 4th round, who they're going to go have a professional career now on the offensive and defensive side of the ball. That's important. And especially on the market for transfers, because yes, people who are listening to this, I'm sure the immediate reaction is, well, what about NIL? Of course it's important, but there's also a degree to which you're trying to attract transfers based on, I have an opportunity for you on the field and I have an opportunity for you basically in the classroom. I'm going to be able to teach you something that you weren't able to do at your last school, something that you might need to do to unlock something for your future. And that's where you're going to find it here. And here's my proof. I was able to do this with this guy and this with this guy. And so I think that the way that they marketed it was really important. And like you said, it's going to be about now, how are they able to parlay that into buy-in with the guys that they have in-house? How are they able to utilize that to their advantage with high school recruits that they're trying to get committed? And then how are they going to be able to utilize that on the transfer market?
All right, Jacob. Well, that does segue us pretty nicely into the second half of the show. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back on the other side, we'll discuss some of the players that might be a good fit for the 2023 NFL draft out of Florida, whether that be seniors or potentially underclassmen that could play their way into NFL draft status. And then we'll talk about the transfer portal because we've had some major deadlines here. And frankly, I think the expectations at Florida have maybe shifted a little bit. So we'll get to that right after this commercial break. Welcome back to the Swamp247 Podcast. I'm Thomas Goldkamp here with Jacob Rudner. Jacob, looking forward to the 2023 NFL draft class. I think there's a lot of unknowns for Florida, and one of the biggest question marks is what kind of talent is left on this roster. And when we talk about the recruiting woes that Dan Mullen had at Florida, where sort of this is one of the reasons why he ended up getting fired at Florida, was the trajectory. You couldn't make a clear case that the trajectory was going to continue going up based on his recruiting. And so that begs the obvious question, well, how much talent is sort of left on this roster? And in the context of the 2023 NFL draft, I think there's at least a couple guys that we can circle. And so maybe we'll do that first. I'll ask you, now that you've been out there for spring, you've seen the spring game, who are some guys on the current roster that you circle right away as this guy is maybe a likely NFL draft pick next year?
Yeah, immediate guys that come to mind are Gervon Dexter, Anthony Richardson, and Osiris Torrance. I would say that those are my 3 if I had to pick guys to get drafted right now and feel really confident about me saying that, those are my 3 picks. I think that Dexter answers all the questions by himself, and I don't think it really needs much explanation. He had a phenomenal spring. He was a former top recruit, looked great, continues to improve even, and this is after he's looked already impressive at the college level. So for all of those reasons, I think that that's an easy pick. Anthony Richardson, you and I talked about on this podcast quite a bit. We were having questions about how things were going in the spring based on the observation window that we had. There were some accuracy problems. We were wondering if he was really going to pan out the way that we thought he had the potential to do. And then all of a sudden we get to the spring game and the guy looks incredible. So I would say that if he keeps on that track, he's got a really good chance to be drafted. I think the question will be, can he actually maximize his draft potential this upcoming season? It's not that he wouldn't get picked if he decided to go. Would he benefit from another year in college? I think that's a legitimate question, but I do think he's a safe bet to get picked if he wanted to be. And then Osiris Torrance, you mentioned him in the first half of the show, just a fundamentally sound offensive lineman, has some serious playing experience under his belt. Now he's going to get to go prove it basically in the SEC. And with a reasonably successful season, I think that he should also be kind of a shoe-in, considering the draft status of some of his former teammates who never had the exposure of SEC football. So those are my 3 easy ones, and I'm sure that you could make an argument that there could be more. But for the sake of safety, I'll stick with the 3.
Well, no, and the interesting thing about those 3 is, I think Torrance is probably more of the proven one, like you said. I think, he's a guy that could have come out in this draft and probably been drafted. But I think what I hear with, Anthony Richardson and Gervon Dexter is they're so athletically talented that they're going to be drafted no matter what, just based on that potential. But they can really cement themselves by sort of taking that next step to being an every down SEC sort of contributor, right? And that's the part where we don't really know, right? Will Anthony Richardson be a guy that can do what he did in the spring game consistently? Or, is he going to have that sort of growing curve where, as teams get tape on him, maybe there's some things that come up. But there's no question about the athletic ability of either Anthony Richardson or Gervon Dexter. I mean, both of those guys get drafted on athletic ability alone, even if they probably go through 4 years of college and aren't super productive. I mean, they're just off-the-page athletes, right? I think the more interesting part is when we were going through and I was going through and sort of looking at the roster and kind of looking at guys that might get drafted or could play their way into draftability, I've got a lot of names that are like, I for sure wouldn't bet on them being drafted if the 2023 draft was right now. But I'm looking at it, and there's a lot of guys that have some potential to play their way into NFL draft picks. I mean, Justin Shorter, maybe needs to get a little bit more consistent catching the football. But, I mean, athletically, he looks the part. Lorenzo Lingard, kind of, another one of those super athlete guys that just, only has 16 carries in his last 2 years at Florida. So you can't sit here now and say, he's a guy that gets drafted. But, I mean, Jacob, you and I heard throughout the spring that he was phenomenal. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see it in the spring game because he tweaked his hamstring. But, I think he's a guy that, with the right work ethic and the right attitude, I think he's a guy that can play his way into the mix.
Yeah, I do too. I think that the biggest problem for Lingard is honestly just going to be reps again. I think that he absolutely has the potential, and we were able to see that, I think, in the limited window that we got during practices. I think we began to understand that from the people who we were talking to who were at the full length of a practice. And like you said, I think we expected fully to be able to see that ourselves at the spring game. And the only thing that stood in the way of that was a minor injury that prevented him from playing. But at the same time, though, you have to wonder how Florida's feeling about that running back room and who are some of the other guys who might eat up carries. I mean, Montrell Johnson had a great spring. Naquan Wright's a guy who is going to probably demand some attention out of the backfield.
Yeah.
And that's not even including the freshmen that they're going to have on the roster who probably are also ready and good enough to be able to take some carries. Although at this point with the depth that they have in that room, Florida could probably safely just say, you can take a red shirt, you'll appear in 4 games and call it a season. And it wouldn't surprise me. At the same time, though, even if that happens, you have to wonder, does Lingard get enough field time to play his way into the 7-round format? I don't know about that. I think he has the potential to, certainly, but I think it might be a little bit too crowded for him.
All right. Well, Brenton Cox is a guy that we hadn't talked about, and he's actually sort of, in my opinion, the flip side of, the raw argument with Anthony Richardson and Gervon Dexter. I mean, he's got all the tools athletically. The problem for him, in my opinion, is more so that he needs to put on tape, now being a guy that's been in college for a while, he needs to put on tape the thing that he hasn't yet, which is a little bit more discipline on the edge. And so that's going to be an interesting one to me, because you kind of see it over the years as guys go through. The NFL draft, a team will take a chance on a guy that maybe doesn't have a ton of tape but has a ton of athletic potential. On the flip side, if you have a guy that has a ton of athletic skill and ability, but he can't do something, like setting the edge consistently, that becomes an issue. So this is almost a year where, to me, he's got to prove it or lose it.
Yeah. No, I think there's no doubt about that. I think you could say the same thing for Ventrell Miller in a way. I think that Ventrell Miller needs to be able to go out there and prove himself that he is worthy of a draft selection. And again, I think I want to make something clear here. You and I aren't saying that these guys aren't pros. I think all of the guys who we're mentioning are at minimum undrafted free agent caliber players, because they're worth a shot. I mean, if you're talking about guys who have the athleticism and the potential to get somewhere, those are the types of guys that teams are going to be more comfortable saying, okay, we're going to pay you minimalistically. We're going to give you a shot on the roster and we'll see what you can do and turn it into. That's very common. I think what we're talking about here is, can they elevate it one step further and put themselves into the draft conversation? And that's where you start to have questions about a guy like Cox and Ventrell Miller. And you go, are you going to be disciplined enough or consistent enough or stay healthy enough to be able to prove yourself over a span of games where scouts and teams are going, yeah, that's a guy who we want to take a shot on. Obviously, if the draft was right now, like you said, and I think it was a good point, probably not for a lot of these guys that we're now mentioning. However, based on potential, Lingard, Cox, Ventrell, and others, what can you do with it? And so I think that those two guys, Cox and Miller, are really good candidates for that category of, like, if you maximize a full season and it goes really well for you, how high can you soar in the draft? And I think that the answer is quite frankly, it's pretty decent potential.
Yeah, and so we talked to Brenton this spring, and he told us the feedback he got last year when he sought feedback from the NFL draft, or I guess when he got NFL draft feedback, he was hearing 4th round. So, he's a guy that if he doesn't show that ability to set the edge, maybe he drops down the board. But if he does, he can play his way up. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine. Is there anybody that we haven't talked, maybe off the radar, that you could see as like a dark horse really having a strong year and playing his way into the draft?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't think so, but I am going to be really curious to see if Florida can add anybody in the transfer portal, and I'll get into the names of who they're talking to in a second. If they can add some of the players who we have confirmed they're having conversations with, yes.
Okay. I'm going to come back to you on that in just a second. I'm going to throw 2 names out there for fans that I think you need to circle. Kingsley at center. I'm not even going to try the last name. I'm terrible at it. But Kingsley, I think, could have a really, really big... Yeah, he told us, and I've said it like 18 different ways, and I don't want to get it wrong. So I'm just going to say Kingsley, I think, is a guy that the staff is really, really high on. He's got a year starting experience at center in the SEC already, and I love his mentality. I forget, I think it was Coach Chaos, Coach Sean Spencer on the defensive line that told us he's got that NFL mentality, that sort of get after you mindset. I think he's a guy that could play his way into, maybe even the middle rounds of the draft. And then Princely Umanmielen, I don't know, I might have said that wrong too. Princely.
Surprised you
Princely
went with
and
that
Kingsley.
last name.
Yeah, I know. I don't know. But I think Princely's a guy that if you look at it, if Brenton Cox is able to step up, if Jervon Dexter has the kind of year he's capable of, he's a guy on the other side that's going to benefit from a lot of single blocking type schemes where I think he could have a really big year. But Jacob, the more important thing is obviously, I think right now for Florida fans, the transfer portal. We had the May 1st deadline. And granted, we're not entirely past that deadline yet because programs, once they're informed that a player wants to go into the NCAA transfer portal, have 2 business days to officially put his name in. So theoretically, we could still have some transfer portal news here in the next day or 2. But I think what we're hearing is that Florida's not going to have anywhere close to the movement that we thought maybe earlier in the spring.
Yes, and that goes both ways. There is not going to be as much departure action as we had initially thought there would be, especially with Florida currently coming in over the scholarship limit of 85 players. That's the first thing. And the second is that I think that we're not going to see as much of an addition through the transfer portal for Florida. And Billy Napier confirmed as much during his speaking tour stop in Lakeland. He basically said, we are going to do our due diligence. We are going to look through the portal. We're going to have the conversations, but we don't feel like we necessarily need to be super aggressive. And that was a pretty dramatic change of pace on the tone from basically 2 weeks earlier. On April 9th, he explicitly said, we need to be aggressive in the transfer portal. And he talked about how they don't have great depth on the roster. I think the quote was exactly, we have a solid group of ones, we have some decent twos, and after that, we're looking for talent. And so that is a pretty different tone to set in comparison to, we're going to look, but it's not a priority.
Right.
And we're going to figure it out. And now, one thing that he did say is that part of that is because they feel confident about where they're at in the 2023 recruiting class on the high school side. And you take up scholarships through the portal, you lose scholarships on the high school end. And so that is a factor. There's no doubt about it. So I think that it's pretty obvious that one of two things needs to happen here. The first is there needs to be some action on the high school side to basically justify, hey, we're not going to go after guys in the portal right now because we need to save those scholarships for the high school kids we want. And we feel like, and there's truth to this, by the way, where, you know, if you're Billy Napier, you feel like there's a degree to which transfers are kind of temporary solutions, whereas high school kids are permanent solutions to problems. So that is an element. But we're going to have to see how this works out. And I will add, before I throw it back to you on your thoughts, I will add that there is the ability for players to transfer after May 1st and still gain immediate eligibility. It just requires a waiver from the NCAA, and that is fairly easy to obtain. There are a list of reasons why players can receive a waiver. One of which, by the way, and I think that this is important, is if the coaching staff calls a kid up and says, hey, we need to have a meeting with you. Kid goes to the office and they say, listen, we don't have any playing time for you. We're stacked at your position. We think that you should look elsewhere. All that kid has to do is call up the NCAA and say, they're pushing me out. They're telling me I need to leave. It's an instant waiver. It's one of several reasons I believe that almost immediately qualifies. So it's not like the transfer portal has stopped. It's not like we're out of that yet. I think that there's going to be a lot of time to see how things shake out on the high school and the transfer recruiting end, because there are still guys who they're talking to. And then we might see the departures.
Yeah, I think, okay, so first off, let me clear up from a number standpoint as well, since you mentioned numbers. Florida, I have them at 88 scholarships right now. So initially the thinking was if Florida was going to take 4, maybe 5, 6 transfers in the portal, you were going to need to see like 10 guys leave. We're not at that place anymore, obviously. I think, Florida's probably only looking at 1, 2, maybe 3 transfers max. And you don't necessarily need transfers out to get that 85 number by fall camp. You're going to have some guys that maybe have been injured throughout their career. We saw Gage Wilcox take a medical hardship in the spring. You'll have some guys that are probably encouraged to graduate, maybe look elsewhere. But you can get down to the 85 number pretty easily. The other number is Florida was at 24 in the signing class, including transfers in. So they can't replace up to 7 guys that transfer out beyond the 25 cap. So numbers really aren't an issue, I don't think, as much as we maybe thought they would be. But the bottom line is, like you said, Jacob, I think Florida's being a lot more selective. I do think that they feel good about the 23 class. But, Florida is talking to a couple guys. So I know that one of them that they've been talking to is an Arizona State receiver, Ricky Pearsall, that you've talked to. Can you give us a quick update on where things are at with him?
Yeah, so things are headed in a generally positive direction at the moment for Florida. I think that his visit went really well. I spoke to his father, Rick Pearsall, on Sunday. We're recording this on a Monday afternoon. And he basically said that the trip blew them away. The hospitality, the facilities, all of the things that they were able to talk about with the coaching staff, everything came away as positive. I think the biggest challenge for Florida is going to be that he still has plans to make other visits. And that's going to be to Auburn, Oregon, Utah, and Notre Dame. I do think, based on my conversations with a couple people, that there is a possibility that 2 of those remaining 4 visits get taken off the list, and he tries to accelerate his decision. And if that's the case, Florida's in a really good spot because Florida's already received its visit. It's not at danger of being cut from the list at this point. And so Florida, I would say, is in the running firmly for Ricky Pearsall. The other player who Florida is talking to right now is former Arizona State defensive lineman Jermaine Lole. Now, the biggest difference between Lole and Pearsall. Pearsall, my perception is that he's really looking for playing time. He wants to go be developed. He's looking for a situation where he can be plugged in and be a primary target on a team's offense. And if there are NIL opportunities that come along within that. So school calls and says, hey, we have a major opportunity at wide receiver, plus we have opportunities for you on the financial front. That would be the order in which I think he's looking at things. Jermaine Lole, on the other hand, entered the portal specifically for NIL opportunities. He wants to explore his market. That was reported by Sun Devil Source, the 24/7 page at Arizona State. And so I think that Florida has had conversations with him, but Florida needs to keep in mind that this is a financial decision. I also know that Lole is interested in returning potentially to Arizona State if the Sun Devils can, around the program, figure out some sort of NIL deal for him.
Jacob, any other transfer portal thoughts or anything we need to be aware of as we close here?
I think that Florida is in a position where it does need to make some movement. I think it would be an interesting turn of events to go from we need to be aggressive to landing nobody. And I think that they are aware of that, which is the reason behind them still pursuing guys. And you know, as I said before, and I think you also said it too, it's fine if you're not going to be super aggressive and take 10 guys from the portal, but you also then definitely need to be super aggressive and successful on the high school side. So I don't think that these are things that the program isn't aware of. I think that the coaching staff is actually acutely aware of its need to be successful in both capacities and to handle the situation over the next several months, you know, and maximize their opportunities. And the thing I would say to people who are listening to our podcast, though, is be patient. I would say let's, you know, wait until August, late July, and then let's take a look at what the roster looks like. Who was added? Who was subtracted?
And the 23 class, too. Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was going to say is who's committed. And at that point, I think it's probably going to be healthiest to really give an assessment. I think right now it's a little premature.
Yeah, I do think you can make a reasonable case that I think Florida might have expected a little bit more to be in the portal, combined with the fact that I don't know that anybody fully anticipated how quickly NIL would become such a big part of the equation. And the reason I say that is obviously we've talked about Florida missing on Darrell Jackson out of Maryland. That was NIL related. But I think the combination of those two things has maybe, sort of been part of the reason that the Gators haven't been as active in the transfer portal and are not looking to turn things over as much as we maybe thought they would. And in that sense, maybe Florida should have been a little bit more aggressive in the fall window. But you got to remember, there were so many things going on for this staff, and that doesn't excuse any misses. It won't save them if this roster has major holes next fall. But there was a lot going on when Billy Napier took over the job. They did do a pretty good job of landing some high-profile high school recruits like Kamari Wilson, like Shamar James. So to your point, I think that I can understand where some recruiting fans would have some concerns, and I get that. I also think, like you said, let's regroup maybe in a month, in 2 months, continue to update. And look, if these high school prospects end up not on the board at Florida and going elsewhere and you still have issues, then trust me, we'll be the first to have some concerns. But I do think, I think being measured in the approach to the transfer portal and not just taking guys just to take guys there's something to be said for that too. So that'll do it for today's episode of the Swamp247 Podcast, guys. We're running out of time here. So we do appreciate you tuning in. If you like the podcast, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube. And if you're listening on an audio-only platform, be sure to leave us a favorable review. Helps us reach more Gator fans, and we obviously appreciate the support. That'll do it for us today, guys. Thank you for tuning in.